Hi, everybody, and welcome. This is Jeff Dalto of Convergence Training, Senior Learning and Development Specialist, with another one of our webcast, audiocast, podcast series, whatever we're calling these. Today, we've got a cool and somewhat unusual guest for us, a kind of unique subject matter. We have Doug Pontsler, and Doug is the Chairman and Managing Director of what's known as COVE, or the Center of Visual Experience. And Doug's here to talk to us about visual literacy in the context of occupational safety, which we're interested in general, and Convergence is interested in too, because we put a lot of work into our visuals for our training courses. So with that, Doug, thank you very much for coming. And if you could tell us a little bit more about yourself, about COVE, and about this project, that would be great.
Awesome, Jeff. Well, thanks for the opportunity to talk with you. Unfortunately, I have to correct you off the bat. It's actually the Center of Visual Expertise.
My eyes are too old man eyes to read.
No worries at all. And I guess, first of all, just a little bit of background on myself. I retired in February of this year from Owens Corning after nearly 40 years of industrial experience, 16 of that with Owens Corning and 23 years with Eaton Corporation. I've been at the industrial world for a long time in a number of different roles. And when I retired from Owens Corning, I was the Vice President of Operations, Sustainability, and Environmental Health and Safety. And it was in that environmental health and safety space, beginning in 2015, we started to investigate visual literacy and what visual literacy meant and whether that had an opportunity to play a role in our safety programs. And as a result of that investigation, beginning in 2015, and then the engagement of some other peer companies that were also interested in the same subject matter, we arrived at determining that yes, this could matter to our work in safety. And simultaneous to that, the work of the Toledo Museum of Art, who we were conferring with on what visual literacy was, developed expertise in being able to establish that bridge from what has historically been taught in art education to its application from an industrial perspective. So when I retired from Owens Corning, I joined the Museum of Art, the Toledo Museum of Art, as Chairman and Managing Director of COVE, in order to be able to sort of advance that thinking in the industrial world. So delighted to be with you today.
Yeah, we're excited. Okay, to that point, if I could move through our second question here, maybe if you could just kind of introduce us at a high level and explain to us what this term visual literacy means.
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that can actually be misunderstood if you just think about it only intuitively. But one of the things that we realized is that, the shorthand for visual literacy is really learning to see. And in art education, that's been taught for decades in terms of being able to look at a piece of art or an object and be able to really appreciate and understand the finer details of that piece or the piece of art or object. And really centers around a few things, and that is, number one, what is it that you see? What does it mean? And as a result of what it means, what action would you take as a result of that? What's your interpretation, of something that you're examining? And as adults, we do a lot of looking and scanning, but we don't do a lot of seeing. And we also do a lot of looking and then sort of jumping to an interpretation without necessarily really thinking through what it is that we're looking at and whether we're actually seeing everything that's in front of us or not. So visual literacy gives us a discipline and a structure that is utilized in art education for being able to look at something, to be able to really see what's there, really be able to think about what that means and what the interpretation of that looks like, and then being able to determine what action might be appropriate. And if you think about the work that we do in safety around hazard recognition or around incident investigation or around design for safety reviews, and we could continue to kind of go down the list of the sort of tactical things that goes on in our enterprises every day, it's really all based upon seeing and looking and understanding. And if we think about all of the training that we do in our organizations today, we do a lot of training around whether it's technical aspects or leadership or a number of things. We're subjected to training, nearly every day through our coworkers and their experiences versus ours. But if the thing that is most fundamental to the work that we do as safety professionals is seeing, when is the last time any of us took a class in seeing, or focused on, how could we actually see better than what we do today? And that's what visual literacy is really all about, is being able to take images and situations and be able to truly see what's there.
Thanks. That's a really excellent answer. That the brain devotes a lot of its brain power to processing visuals, and it's true that a lot of us, and that's really helpful. Like if you're evolving on the African savannah and you need to watch out for the lions. But we don't get a lot of training about that in the modern world, and I'll ask a question about that in just a moment. It was also interesting too. You talked about visual literacy being essentially a three-step process: seeing, meaning, and then either acting or interpreting. Mm-hmm. And I was just in a webinar a couple days ago on the other side, being the subject matter expert, and I was referring to with the ASSP, and I was referring to Daniel Kahneman's book, the Nobel Prize-winning behavioral economist, about thinking fast and slow, his book. Mm-hmm. And that's we're hardwired to think fast, and a lot of times that doesn't help us. And so this is yet another message to think slow and overcome your biases and don't automatically jump to conclusions, and learn to interpret things better. So great. Thank you for that answer. And then for the next question, I've read some of your materials because I've been kind of fascinated with your project. And one of the things I read you guys in somewhere, a white paper you guys created. I'm sorry. I'm one question ahead of you. Let me ask this. If your goal is to teach people visual literacy, am I correct in assuming that some people are either born with more visual literacy or somehow develop it on their own, and on the other hand, some people have less? And for those people who have less, is this something they can learn, or are they kind of stuck in a lower level?
No, I think anyone can improve their ability to see what's in front of them, to be able to apply these disciplines and these processes, to be able to see more completely. Whether you've practiced that specifically in the past, we can always get better. What we find is most people really don't think about this as a skill to be developed. If we're able-sighted, we've been seeing all of our lives. So we're pretty confident that when we look at something, we're actually seeing what's there. And the reality is we're not. And often the way that plays itself out in the industrial world that we work in, I don't know how many times after an incident, someone might say, I have walked by that 1,000 times and I never saw that trip hazard, or I never saw that sharp edge. Or in my history, I've had plant leaders that have asked, me to send resources into plants to provide a fresh eyes, someone to come in and be able to look at something because they feel like they can no longer see the forest for the trees. And I certainly support that. That's not a bad practice at all, and there's a lot of good that can come from it. But it begs the question why we can't always see the things that we should be seeing that's in front of us. The good news is that a lot of times our history and our experiences and the biases that we have lead us to, good conclusions. So, most of the time, we're pretty good at being able to see things and be able to understand what they mean and act accordingly. But it's in those few times that we don't that's the difference between perfection and a level of performance that we might actually be at. And quite honestly, a lot of the interest in visual literacy comes from companies who have had, and individuals who have had that long tail of improvement. They've come a long way in terms of improving their safety performance. But the more progress you make, the more difficult those remaining steps are. And they're looking for new and different solutions to improve the skill level of their people and themselves to be more effective in their safety practices.
That's good. That's interesting, that last point about getting those diminishing marginal returns as you get it safer and safer. And this is yet another tool to get one notch safer. So I'm glad that this is something people can learn, and that again jives with my experience as a learning and development specialist. Sometimes people think somebody's born with something and I can't get it, but it's just the whole idea of grit and working and learning. And the other thing you pointed out that I thought was great was the value of having a professional or a more experienced person with mastery in a topic point out to you like, hey, this is actually a skill and you don't have it, or you get better at it, and I can help you if you can practice it and I can give you constructive feedback, and together we can
Yeah.
improve. But a lot of times we don't know we have our own skill gap.
That's the beauty of the partnership with the Toledo Museum of Art, and the Toledo Museum of Art has that expertise in being able to look and interpret and as a result determine what actions are appropriate to take as it relates to art and art education. We bring the industrial component in terms of how does that apply to the work that we do. So it's through this partnership with the Toledo Museum of Art that really resulted in the creation of this enterprise.
I'm glad you called that out, because I love that partnership in general, and it's not every day you're talking occupational safety and the art museum. So that's cool. So here's a question I was going to ask earlier. For some of your literature, I read, kind of picked this note up in one of your white papers. Are there some people, I'm sorry, before we dig deeper into the use of visual literacy for improving occupational safety, how is this part of a bigger effort to increase the use of soft sciences such as organizational behavior, management studies, social psychology, learning theory, and training in occupational safety?
Yeah, I think it fits into that same space. I wouldn't tell you that it was born out of any natural extension of those practices that we see today. An emphasis on human performance and how do we keep our enterprises capable of performing at the level that we want them to perform at? How do we appreciate the role that human factors and fatigue and all those other issues come into play? I think the commonality with those things with respect to visual literacy is just the idea that we can learn from other disciplines and we can apply that learning into something that we do, for example, around safety. And I think that's the relationship, that exists between our work in visual literacy and some of the work that goes on in those other areas.
Great. And another question, kind of somewhat based on a white paper of yours and also on a bestseller book, The Signal and the Noise. I wonder if you could explain to us how visual literacy might improve occupational safety by improving a person's ability to see a signal, which the risk or the hazard, through the noise, which are the kind of the everyday events that are familiar, routine, and safe, and that don't lead to a negative outcome.
Yeah, great question. The heart of what we focus on when it comes to the application of visual literacy in the workplace is having a disciplined way of looking at a situation, looking at a work environment, looking at a piece of equipment, and having a method of being able to sort of process what's in front of you. Each of us as individuals, when we look at a particular thing, it could be construction work that's underway, it could be the design of a piece of equipment, it could be a number of things. We are drawn to certain things because of our natural sort of history, our biases, the things that we're comfortable with. And we don't necessarily look at everything that's there, where we're drawn to certain characteristics, which opens up the possibility that we could miss some things that are really important. We teach the methodology of leveraging the elements of art, which are lines and shapes and colors and space and texture, in order to be able to sort of step back from what we would naturally look at and start to look for things that are consistent in really in art and objects. So when we start to look for lines, we start to see things that we might not have seen had we not been looking for lines. When we start to look at colors, we start to see things that we might not have looked for if we weren't looking for colors. So if we quickly step our way through a structure that involves those elements of art, all of a sudden we're beginning to see things that we wouldn't have naturally seen. And the connection to safety is just simply some of those things that we didn't see because we weren't following some sort of a disciplined process might be the hazard that actually creates the incident when that human and hazard comes together.
Great. Good answer. And leads really nicely into my next question, which was, again, from reading your materials, I know that you have kind of called out 5 specific elements of design. You talked about a couple, including line and color. I wonder if you could tell us what those 5 elements are and maybe kind of briefly go into a little detail about each of the 5.
Yeah, happy to. First of all, lines, and pretty self-explanatory in terms of looking at something and looking for the lines that are present or things that maybe should be a line and aren't. An example of that could very well be a cord that is laying across the floor and there's a coil in that cord and it's sticking up and could represent a trip hazard. We have some things that are not straight in a manufacturing or distribution facility or any other facility that should be straight, like a bracket holding up a shelf that might have been struck by a powered industrial vehicle and needs to be repaired, or it could cause a problem. So we're looking for those characteristics that would lead us to, something that could be wrong. In the case of space, it's been interesting in many of the companies that we've worked with as we think more and more about space. It sort of ties into the ergonomics issue associated. Do we have sufficient space to be able to safely be able to do the work that we need to do? A common challenge, particularly for maintenance individuals, is there enough space to be able to safely do the work that they need to do on a production line or a piece of equipment? Or has that space been compromised because we're trying to be so efficient in how we design the equipment and the product flow that we really don't leave enough room for other things that will go on and could present a hazard when they're underway. Colors, often we're looking for, contrast and things that are a little bit different, in the workplace. Could represent, on a nice, shiny, clean floor. It could represent a spill by being, different from the floor, which again, represents a hazard. So we move through those elements of art in order to be able to identify what could be abnormal conditions.
Great. And if we had line and color, what are the three other of the five you call out? Space?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, lines, shapes, colors, space, and texture.
Right. Okay, you did say them all. Great. Well, before I jump to the next question, and partly in an effort to show off that beautiful poster you have behind you, I wondered if I noticed lines on the side of that poster. I noticed a change in color, and I wondered if you could just move it a second to show off that beautiful color. So there we go. There's the COVE We Speak Visual Language poster. Thanks for sharing that with us.
Yeah.
All right. So those are the five elements of design. And then in addition, COVE, I think, has identified six, what are we reading here? Once people are familiar with the five elements of design, what's the 6-step process you recommend people to use to visually read their work environment for safety? How can they use those when they're reading work?
Yeah, what we really do, Jeff, is we expand upon the whole idea of moving from looking to seeing, from describing to interpretation, and then being able to take action as a result. So when we talk about those 6 things, we're really talking about looking, observing, and seeing. And if you think about this as a triangle, we're beginning at the looking stage, and we're getting into more detail and more detail until we really see what is there. And then once we see what's there, we have to have an ability to be able to describe it so we can explain it to others, and we can also interpret what that means. So we move from that C component up to being able to describe it, and typically describe it with a set of common language so others know that, what we're talking about. That's particularly important in a manufacturing environment where we're trying to communicate, the issues that we're seeing in a way that others can understand it. And many companies have their own language, and that's okay. It's just important that language is common among the people that need to know what we're talking about. And then by being able to describe it, we can then analyze what's there. We can really begin to understand what that means, which leads to the interpretation. And once we've interpreted something, then we have the opportunity to decide, does it deserve action or does it not deserve action? And if so, what is the appropriate action? The thing we're trying to break is the idea of look and interpret, look and interpret, look and interpret. And under time pressure, or whether we self-create that time pressure or not, we often do that. We often look and then leap to a conclusion. And that's the cycle that we want to break in terms of not doing that, so we can be more confident in our interpretation.
Great. I love that. It's a good answer. So multiple times now, you've at least a few times, you've talked about visual biases, and clearly this idea of look and interpret that you're trying to break is related to visual biases. I wonder if you could tell us more about visual biases and how these visual biases are related to our ability, or rather our inability, to correctly perceive risks and hazards in the workplace.
Yeah, I think, a lot of the bias component just simply comes from our experiences. When we enter a particular situation, we may have experiences that tell us what we might anticipate seeing. And because of that, that's what we see. And if we're totally objective about entering a situation and looking to see what's there, then we might not be so conditioned to expecting what we've seen before to be there. So, some people might walk into a particular situation and, they see all the trip hazards, they see all the working from heights issues, et cetera, but they miss other things that really aren't in their normal, sort of thinking process. And that's what we're trying to open up is a broader view of the world.
Great. I bet you've seen this. I think a good example that's not relevant to occupation, well, it's not specific to occupational safety, but still relevant. There are videos out on YouTube and I'll embed it into this blog article where you're asked to count the number of times people in a circle are passing a basketball.
Yeah.
And you watch that and you're counting it so closely because that's what you're supposed to be looking for. You don't realize a bear walks right through the middle of this.
Yeah, that's right. It's a famous experiment.
Yeah, you can miss it completely, and then you're told to see it, and you can't imagine how you missed it. And that's similar to what you're talking about, I guess.
Yeah, one of the key learning moments that we sort of go through and teach to is this whole idea of once you see something, it's really hard to unsee it. So there's great value in being able to see it for the first time. And we take individuals through a series of photographs that begin in black and white. And there's a predator that's in that picture. You just can't see it because it sort of blends into the overall black and white background. When we add color, all of a sudden the predator is obvious because the contrast provides that view. And that all makes sense, and that probably wouldn't come to much surprise. But what is interesting is when we go back to the black and white photograph, you can now see the predator that you didn't see the first time. And I'm pretty confident that months, years later, if you enter that same photograph, it may take you a few moments to kind of orient yourself, but you will be conditioned to remember that, yeah, there was a predator in the bottom right-hand corner, and I can still see the predator.
Yeah. Similar example. All right. Well, this is fascinating. I appreciate your time. I wonder if for people out there who would like to learn more about either contact you or get in contact with COVE or learn more about the project, what can they do? Who do they need to contact, and where can they do it?
Yeah, we would love you to come to our website, which is www.covectr.com. And on our website, we have some good information with regard to what visual literacy is all about, how it applies. We have some reference materials there as well. And we have a workshop schedule if you're interested in attending a workshop. We have those scheduled through the first half of 2019. And would love to have dialogue with you in any form you'd like to understand more about what we're doing.
Great. And that workshop you talked about, is that a in-person brick and mortar workshop that occurs in Toledo?
It is, and it's a great experience. We do workshops in museums, most of which are done at the Toledo Museum of Art, which is one of the finest museums in the country. And our core workshop is called Foundations, and it's a 2-day workshop. And over the 2-day period, we spend roughly a third of our time or so in the classroom, and the balance of the time out in the galleries of the museum doing exercises that use the objects of art to be able to educate us on the aspects of visual literacy and how we can practice and become more proficient in being able to look at something, really see what's there, and be able to interpret in a more accurate way what that really means.
Well, cool. I would love to go. I hope to do that sometime. I encourage anybody out there listening to try to make it there. Toledo's a great town, not too far from my hometown of Detroit, right there on Lake Erie. Easy to miss, but a cool place to visit. And Doug, am I correct? So I originally learned about your project from a white paper put out by the Campbell Institute. And if I'm correct, the National Safety Council recently had their annual conference. And I think maybe you had just released an updated version of that white paper. Is that true at that time?
Yeah, that is correct. We've been in partnership with the Campbell Institute at the National Safety Council really since the inception of this idea. I was a very active National Safety Council member. I chaired the Campbell Institute up until this last Congress was a board member of the National Safety Council as well up until this last Congress. And the National Safety Council has been following pretty closely this evolution of visual literacy and its application to safety. And it's actually the Campbell Institute that's been publishing the white papers. There's been two, one to sort of outline what it's all about and why we're interested in it. And the second one, an update of some work that's underway to begin to quantify the impact and both qualitatively and quantitatively. And this is a study that will go on for the next couple of years. Okay,
cool. All right, well, thanks for sharing your information. Is there a question I should have asked you that I didn't, or anything else you'd like to tell people about the visual literacy or visual literacy for safety or COVE or your project or anything?
Yeah, I would just encourage everyone to investigate what it's about, because, as I said in the beginning, it really goes back to that opening, sort of premise that how important safety is in the work that we do in identifying things that we can do to make the workplace safer for our people, and what our people can do to make the workplace safer for themselves. And for how important that is, we really spend no time training people in terms of how to be more effective in what they see. So, it makes a lot of sense that if we can upskill ourselves as individuals and our teams to be more effective in that, the work that we're going to do is going to be able to be done more effectively than what it might be today. And then the second thing is that doesn't stop at the gate or the street where we enter the workplace. We're 8 or 9 or 10 times more likely to be injured at home or on our roadway than we are in the workplace. The skills of being able to see more effectively work in our basement, in our garage, in our stairways, at home just as well as they do in the workplace. So it really is a 24/7 kind of thing.
Two good points. I especially like the point about, hey, we should learn visual literacy for safety and hazard ID. And in particular, just the whole idea of hazard ID. People always tell you it's really important to train workers to identify hazards, but you don't see as much about how to do it. So this is a really great contribution.
Yeah. We're excited about the work we're doing.
Yeah. Well, thanks to Doug. Everybody out there, thanks for listening in. We hope you appreciate it. If you're watching this in a video form, know that there's also I'm going to type this up. It'll be an article form. You could read it if you wish at the Convergence Training blog as well. So it'll be in one or two formats. We want to thank Doug and COVE for their time and expertise and sharing their information about this project. Once again, this is Doug Pontsler, Chairman and Managing Director, Center of Visual Expertise. Did I get it right that time?
You sure did.
All right. And thanks everybody out there. And Doug, I'm going to hit the pause button. We can chat on the other side. Thanks again for your time.